We're seeing the consequences of bad ideas throughout the West. Multiculturalism, diversity for diversity's sake, these are all bad ideas. They're ideas that have their basis in the Christian faith, but you see, minus the God of the Christian faith, Popper came to the conclusion that any ideology that claimed to have the truth, to possess the absolute truth, was a very dangerous ideology. This is a recreation of the Roman pantheon. In a world like that, what ends up happening is the state may say that they respect all cultures. At the end of the day, everyone is expected to bend the knee at the altar of the state, which represents the truth. One of the ideas that we're talking about today is mass immigration and open borders. Those are ideas that are affecting the Western world. So the question becomes, how did we get here? Well, welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry, Alex Taunton, and we've been consistently talking about dangerous ideologies. We call them ideologies here because it's idiots, who buy into them, who believe them, and especially those that threaten the Western world and the United States most of all. Now, the West is, I maintain, trapped in a kind of giant pincer movement, a military strategy where on the one hand you have militant secularism and on the other hand you have militant Islam. Now, last week I addressed Islam. It wasn't the first time. It won't be the last time. And in fact, I'm going to talk about it a good bit today. But this week I want to explain how these twin ideologies, these twin ideologies, which are opposite in so many ways, work together, how they interact with one another. Now, if you're new to Ideas Have Consequences, and I know that many of you are, we look at ideas both theoretically and practically. And a way of simply explaining that is, on the one hand, we look at where the ideas are developed upstream, and then we go downstream to see how they are, affecting the lives of billions of people. And sometimes an idea, can be a very good idea, and it can be an idea that it can affect change, bring about a very positive change in the lives of millions or even billions of people. But typically on Ideas Have Consequences, that's not what we're looking at. What I'm trying to help you see, I'm really, a teacher at heart. I'm trying to help you see these ideas through a biblical lens, that you might better understand them and be able to navigate the world that is around you. And also to feel some measure of confidence in engaging. And that really is something that we need good people to do. They have to be willing to engage the world around them. And that doesn't mean you need your own podcast or even that you need to be on social media, but it might just be having a conversation with your neighbor over the backyard fence, or a colleague at the water cooler, or these days, maybe the person sitting in the pew next to you. That's the kind of thing that I'm trying to encourage here, to equip you, to mobilize you, to get you out there. And so when we're talking about the development of ideas, when we're talking about them, upstream, we're talking about places like Davos, the World Economic Forum, which I have talked a lot about on this show. And I'll talk about again because I'll be attending again for the, I don't remember, third or fourth year in a row. I will be in Davos in January at their annual gathering. But that's not the only place where ideologies, bad ideas, policies are formulated. They're formulated in universities. They're formulated in the halls of government in Washington, D.C., and in the many think tanks where billions of dollars are spent with guys who are, often have very little practical interaction with or experience with the ideas that they're talking about. And that's why what I feel like I bring to you on this show that is unique is that I'm not simply pontificating, some from my my studio or from my high rise in Manhattan or from the studios of CNN. Rather, what we're doing here, when I say that we're looking at ideas upstream and then their effect on millions and even billions of people downstream, we're going there. We're going there. And I'm not in the field all the time. Nobody can be. It's expensive. It sometimes is very dangerous and it's exhausting. So I return to the Batcave. I return here and I gather my strength and I do my research and then I sally forth again to parts unknown around the world. But the reason I feel that that's so important is I came to believe that while I was a graduate student. First, just for myself, not because I was thinking so much in terms of defending the faith or combating evil ideologies at that point in my life, but just simply because I felt like, someone who was teaching history, both at the university level as a TA, and then eventually, teaching in a preparatory school, very expensive preparatory school. And then, of course, to you, through my work of Fixed Point Foundation and as a writer, I thought it was important that I have visited the places that I was talking about. So, for instance, if I'm teaching Western civilization, I thought it was kind of a handicap early on in my career that I'd never actually seen the pyramids. I couldn't afford it. I came from a lower middle income, family. My parents can afford to send me, anywhere around the world at that stage of my life. And there were other very, significant things that I was teaching that I hadn't yet had any practical interaction with. And once I was able to, either through fellowships, through grants, or maybe because I was leading tour groups and eventually because I was a writer, once I did start seeing some of those places that I was teaching, climbing, through the cistern in Mycenae, going to Troy, going to Ephesus, walking through the Palace of Versailles or through Buckingham Palace or whatever the case might be, and climbing through the pyramids. Once I began doing that, it changed my perception. It changed my teaching. I began to season my teaching with experience, with things that really offered perspective that I didn't previously have. And that's what we're doing here. Once you get out of your ivory tower, as very few writers, reporters, pontificators, politicians, policymakers, policy wonks, academics do these days, it tends to make a difference in the way you see the world. And that's part of the problem. One of the things that I feel very passionate about these days is it angers me that so many politicians, so many of the people who would rule our lives, would govern us, they don't see what their policies do to people, how they can wreck lives. Or maybe they don't even see something that's positive and they want to change it because they don't really know what it is. And that's because they don't have to. They can, and when they do, it's usually carefully orchestrated. You arrive in a caravan and security, and you are shown the things that, people want you to see. You view the Potemkin village, and then you go back to your ivory tower and you report to people that you've really had boots on the ground and you've really been seeing what's going on in Ukraine or, in Gaza or something like that. And frequently that just simply isn't the case. It's a lie. It's a Potemkin village. It's faux reporting. Not always, but occasionally. So we're trying to get a look at both ends. The way I sometimes think of it is, you're at a rifle range and you're trying, different rounds. You're trying different munitions, and you fire them, and then you go down range to see the actual impact, to see what's actually taking place. And that's what we're doing here, but we're doing it with ideas. Tonight, for example, I plan to crash an Antifa meeting, And it's because it's advertised on their Facebook page. I won't say where, but it's been advertised, and it says that it's open to all people. So I decided I would go. Now, I'm not going there with the intention. I have no intention of confronting anyone. I have no intention of disrupting their meeting. I just want to be there the way that I would go to, the World Economic Forum, and just be a fly on the wall to hear them speak, to hear their ideas, and to learn. I want to understand the way they think. And if at some point I get that opportunity to engage them thoughtfully, hopefully with the gospel of Jesus Christ, then that's what I will do. But, I just want to be a fly on the wall this evening. We'll see whether or not I'm allowed to be that or not. My wife says, you have never been a fly on the wall. Never. It is simply not in your nature, and that's why I married you. But I intend to be a fly on the wall. I certainly have no intention of any kind of confrontation there. But we shall see, and I'll report back to you what happens from that. In certain times, wise investors look for stability. Markets are overinflated, inflation remains a concern, and global tensions continue to rise. That's why many are turning to the safety of physical gold and silver. AlphaOmega Gold is a Christian-owned precious metals company known for honesty, transparency, and biblical stewardship principles. Their team help clients protect their investment with integrity and clear guidance, never pressure. Right now, AlphaOmega Gold is offering a free precious metals navigation guide to explain why owning gold and silver can be a smart, strategic hedge for retirement accounts and long-term security. Don't wait until economic shifts impact your future. So today, go and visit www.ao.gold/IHC or call 855-4AO-GOLD. That's 855-426-4653. Call today to learn how simple it can be to secure what matters most. We don't want to be living in the ivory tower. We want to be people who are getting involved. And you see, part of the reason why the culture is where it is because Christians and other conservatives retreated from the culture. And that's because it is the nature of conservatives to live and let live. We don't, as I say on this show all the time, the average conservative gets up in the morning, gets a cup of coffee, and begins to think about their day. That is not how leftists think. And by the way, it's not how Muslims think. They get up in the morning, they get a cup of coffee, and they begin to think about your day too. That's why I refer to the World Economic Forum as the HOA from hell, the Homeowners Association from hell. They want to govern everyone else. But again, we're looking at how these two twin ideologies, Islam on the one hand, militant Islam on one hand, and real Orthodox Islam, as I pointed out, is militant by definition. It is anti-Semitic by definition. That is what Islam is. And all you have to do is read their holy literature and the life of Muhammad, which, he may not have existed. But regardless, they believe they are instructed to follow the life of Muhammad. Muhammad killed 800 Jews in a single day. 800 Jews, slit their throats, throw them in a trench. I don't mean he personally slit all 800, but he was part of that. He commanded it. That's who he was. It is a religion of conquest, if you want to call it a religion at all. It really is an ideological engine of war, of conquest. That's what it is. But we have that on the one hand, as I explained last week and elsewhere. Again, we've done other episodes of Ideas Have Consequences on it. And then on the other hand, we have a militant secularism. And you think, how in the world can these two interact at all? Because in some sense, they're opposites. But only on the surface of it are they opposites. Yes, one is godless or pagan, and the other one is, maintains that there is a God, and he revealed himself to the prophet Muhammad. But they're both about conquest when you really get down to it. They're both tyrannical. And if we were to think of this is, a kind of competition. We eventually, these two ideologies are working in concert together to destroy their common enemy. And what is their common enemy? Christianity. And then once Christianity is out of the way, so the theory goes, the two will then be in war with one another. So this is kind of an old Marxist tactic, the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or united front, as the Marxists will call it, which is where you align with your enemies against the strongest of your enemies, and then you align with your enemies against the next strongest. And it's Agatha Christie, and then there were none. You just keep paring down until you're left as the king of the hill. You're left on top of the heap. That was Stalin. That's what he did. He just gradually bumped off all his enemies by aligning with other enemies who maybe didn't know that Stalin viewed them as enemies, because he was diabolical and clever. But we go downstream and we see how these ideas practically work. What do they look like? What do they look like? So these are, and by the way, these are utopian ideas. I wrote a 4-part series for Daily Wire on this, and I think you can find it on my website, which is not behind a paywall. I think at Daily Wire, if you try to find it, it's called The Great Jet Set. The Great Jet Set. And I think on Daily Wire it is behind a paywall. But anyway, we are seeing the consequences of bad ideas in the United States. But when I say we go downstream, typically that means going to the third world. But not always. We're seeing the consequences of bad ideas throughout the West: multiculturalism, diversity for diversity's sake, tolerance without end. These are all bad ideas. And by the way, they're ideas that have their basis in the Christian faith, but you see, minus the God of the Christian faith, there are no guardrails on these ideas. In other words, Christianity doesn't believe in tolerance of everything. It doesn't believe in diversity for diversity's sake. It believes that there is a diversity of spiritual gifts that work in concert under one God. That's a Christian view. But that's not the way these people, they've completely amputated it from the Christian God. They've grabbed these notions, and we're seeing how they are affecting the Western world and the United States in particular. They're now crashing upon our shores. They almost completely obliterated, Europe. So question becomes, one of the ideas that we're talking about today is mass immigration and open borders. Those are ideas that are affecting the Western world. So the question becomes, how did we get here? Well, last week I made mention of, but we did not get to it because we just simply didn't have time. I made mention of this 2-volume work by Karl Popper. Karl Popper's been dead for a very long time. But Karl Popper, who was an economist, a philosopher at the London School of Economics, sociologist, he wrote these seminal works, again, 2-volume. I'm sure you can find a single volume of it. It's called The Open Society and Its Enemies. Volume 1 is Plato, and Volume 2 is Hegel and Marx. The Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl Popper. We'll put this in the show notes. Karl Popper is an interesting guy, and I have to say that there's a lot that he says that I find very compelling and that you wouldn't object to. But Karl Popper's name has been besmirched, A, because some of his ideas were not very good ideas, but chiefly because of a student of his at the London School of Economics, a man by the name of George Soros. Yes, George Soros was a student of Popper's, and George Soros took the name of Popper's seminal work, the Open Society and its enemies, and he created a nonprofit called the Open Society Foundation. So if you've ever heard of the Open Society Foundation, that's the connection. That's the connection. Soros took the name from Karl Popper, and it has a very, kind of innocuous, sound to it. It doesn't sound particularly harmful. And in fact, if you can find videos of Popper online talking about the Open Society, the philosophy that he labeled the Open Society. And again, some of it makes a lot of sense, but let me try to give a kind of brief synopsis of what this is about. And we're all products of our own time. I find that is always the case. None of us can quite escape our own time, because the thinking, not just of our time, but of our specific context, our specific, friend group or, culture, it affects us very deeply in the way we see the world. And Popper was no different. And Popper was Austrian, and he lived through the Second World War, and he lived through the height of the Cold War. And Popper was deeply disturbed, as many, of course, were and would be, by what he saw and what he experienced. Popper was in Vienna when Hitler's Wehrmacht came goose-stepping through the streets. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria to the Third Reich. And Popper was deeply disturbed by fascism, by Nazism, didn't like it. And then, of course, on the heels of the Second World War, post-1945, we see yet another ideology that's quite similar, as we've said in recent episodes of Ideas Have Consequences: communism, Marxism, fascism, not fascism, though fascism is a twin of Marxism, of communism, socialism. Both socialism, or let me put it another way, both fascism and Marxism, communism, are socialist ideologies, and they compete with one another for supremacy. We're seeing it now. In fact, we're even seeing a kind of an odd bastardization of those ideologies, where they are, kind of a strange mixture of the two. We're seeing it in the World Economic Forum, as I have pointed out on here before. But both fascism, Nazism, and communism, that is socialism, Marxism, both of them claim to be scientific. They both claim to be scientific, and both claim to be the truth, the absolute truth. And Popper, seeing this, and you should understand that Popper wasn't religious. He wasn't hostile to all religious belief, but Popper was an agnostic, and that's significant in understanding Popper's own thinking. It was very secular minded. And so Popper came to the conclusion that any ideology that claimed to have the truth, to possess the absolute truth, was a very dangerous ideology. And thus, for liberal democracies to sustain themselves, there must be a permanent uncertainty about who has the truth. Permanent uncertainty about who has the truth. This is the recreation, this is the recreation of the Roman pantheon, which literally means the hall of the gods. We don't know which one of these gods is the god. So what we're going to do is require all of you to worship the emperor, worship the Roman state. And then we will take your gods in the various regions that we conquer throughout North Africa and Asia Minor and in Europe, Britannia. We'll take your gods and we'll respect them too. We're very tolerant, very multicultural. And we will take your gods and we will put them in the pantheon. We'll worship them too. That was their answer. declare everyone's truth as equally valid. Now, of course, it never actually works out that way. In a world like that, what ends up happening is the state may say, I mean, we're seeing this all over the Western world, the state may say that they respect all cultures, all points of view, but of course they don't. At the end of the day, everyone is expected to bend the knee at the altar of the state, which represents the truth. Now, we saw this with Jacinda Ardern, where during COVID, she says that we are the arbiters of truth. It was really a statement that came straight out of 1984. We are the truth. The state is the truth. So when you hear that the state, Democrat politicians, for instance, saying that they want a tolerant, multicultural society, they're lying, because at the end of the day, they do believe in an absolute truth, and they believe they embody it. They believe they represent it. And this was true. This is exactly what the Romans did. The Romans were not going to, declare everyone's God, everyone's form of government, everyone's culture is equally valid, because they demanded that you worship the emperor. We've seen this, the famed letter between Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Bithynia, and the Emperor Trajan, to whom he wrote and said, we've arrested a number of these people who call themselves Christians, and we require them to worship your image, and if they don't, then we execute them. So, I mean, that's the way the Roman pantheon worked. It was lip service to everyone's God, to everyone's truth, but the only truth that was actually valid was that which was declared by the Roman state. And that's the direction we're going. So Popper believed, rightly so, by the way, having seen the Holocaust, having seen the horrors of Stalinism, to say nothing of the horrors of Maoism, where, the Holocaust, roughly 8 million people killed in the death camps, and via other means, worked through annihilation, as the Germans called it. Stalin killed, as many as, according to Robert Conquest, the late Robert Conquest at the Hoover Institute, Stalin killed as many as 30 million of his own people. Solzhenitsyn puts the number at about 60 million. And Mao killed between 40 and 70 million Chinese. Popper, seeing this, said, the problem is that anyone who thinks they possess the absolute truth feels that it is their right to eliminate anyone who is a threat to that truth, who does not accept that truth. Anyone who believes they have the truth becomes dogmatic and therefore dangerous. Hence the reason that Popper pushed this idea of an open society. What is an open society? An open society is one where truth claims are examined according to evidence. So far, I dare say that most of you would agree with Popper. I do, up to this point, that all truth claims must be subjected to evaluation. So Popper would look at something like, say, during COVID, where you have multiple Western governments declaring that the science says, follow the science, but then refuse to allow actual scientists and other thoughtful people to evaluate those truth claims. Popper would say that's not an open society. He would say that is a closed society, and thus an undemocratic society. Any society that does not allow for competing ideas to have a place in the marketplace of ideas is a closed society. So traditionally, the United States has been a kind of open society because we're tolerant to a point. I mean, unless they're very, very dangerous and deadly and genocidal ideas, although that's changed in recent years. We've tolerating all kinds of nonsense, and certainly Britain has, and Western Europe. But where, if you're a crackpot, like, say, Louis Farrakhan, you're allowed an audience to go out there and say what you want to say. And if people want to listen to you, fine. And if they don't, fine. But the real marketplace of ideas is one where you don't suppress opposing ideas. You allow them to be heard. You allow them to be heard, again, unless there's calls for assassinations or murders or, this kind of thing. And again, I recognize that in recent years, we have tolerated a lot of that in the United States. I've seen videos, we played it for you last week, of Muslim clerics calling for exactly those kinds of things in London. And here you have Lawrence Fox, my colleague and dear friend, who's being persecuted for exercising his free speech regarding ULEZ cameras, the ultra low emissions zone cameras, where the Blade Runners were going around with these handsaws and cutting those things down. And Lawrence expressed his support for what they were doing, or at least his understanding for why they were doing it. And he is brought to court and tried by the British government. Meanwhile, you have actual terrorists who are going out and calling for genocide against Jews and Christians, and nothing is being done to them. That's not what we mean by an open society. That, at least that's not what Karl Popper meant by an open society. He wasn't calling for just anything. So Popper was saying that part of the reason we ended up with these genocides is because competing voices in places like China, in places like Russia, in places like Nazi Germany were suppressed, and in some cases deported, executed, just simply weren't allowed to speak. So having lived through this, Popper says the answer is an open society. But how's that playing out? Well, in Soros's interpretation of what that means, it seems to mean open borders. It seems to mean that you have to allow inside your borders people who do not respect your culture, do not want to preserve it, and indeed want to destroy it. That's not merely a competing voice. That's not merely a competing idea. That's something altogether different. But you see, once you look at an idea like that, at the idea level, we're going upstream now. We're upstream. We're in the think tank. We're listening to guys like Popper. And I'd encourage you to go and watch some videos of him. Read these. They're quite readable. They're interesting ideas that he is proposing here. But because Popper wasn't a Christian, he didn't believe that there actually is an absolute truth. And I, as a Christian, believe that there is an absolute truth. The fact that there are competing false truth claims doesn't make me believe the claims of Christ any less. I just look at those and go, well, I would have wanted to say to Karl Popper, well, yes, of course, the truth claims of the communists and the truth claims of the fascists were false truth claims, unscientific truth claims, and it led to genocide. That doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We say, well, I guess that means there's actually no truth. But that seems to be where you kind of arrive within Popper's paradigm. And I want to be clear, I'm having to grossly simplify Popper's ideas for the sake of this particular show and to help you see how these kinds of ideas are affecting the way you're living. Whether you've ever heard of Karl Popper or not, I promise you, Karl Popper has had an enormous influence upon the way you live. People all over the world, billions of people, their lives have been affected by the thinking of Karl Popper, and particularly because his student, it was a kind of Judas, took Popper's ideas, warped them, and then decided to implement them with his billions of dollars by buying off politicians all over the world, which is what he has done. And that's led to open borders, because the thought process here is the way we change societies is we mix them with other competing ideologies which are brought in by other competing people groups. So the Japanese prime minister recently, in the last month, was forced to resign. You know why? This has made almost no news in the West, and this is very significant. It was because he was pushing open borders, the open society. Not Popper's open society, not his version of the open society, but George Soros's warped version of the open society. You see, these are all these WEF, these World Economic Forum politicians who have, in a sense, either been seduced intellectually or they've been seduced by power because they've been promised loads of it. And you become part of this sort of global fraternity. Everybody's doing it. We're all opening our borders. We're all ignoring what our own constituents want. We're all ignoring our own people, our own voters. And we're forcing upon them a utopian ideology that we believe is going to transform the world into something really excellent and wonderful. But in order to get there, to make an omelet, you got to crack a few eggs. And the eggs are you. The eggs are me. The eggs are the millions, indeed billions of people whose lives are being affected downstream by these ideas. I want to offer a little footnote right here about human life. Once Christianity bleeds out of the culture, like a slow leak out of a tire, we move increasingly towards barbarism. I remember making this argument to Richard Dawkins some years ago, and then he used it in a Times interview, which I thought was quite interesting, in which Richard Dawkins, the atheist, was suddenly saying that Christianity was a bulwark against something much worse, a kind of barbarism that, comes in and sort of fills, the vacuum that is left by the Christian faith. And Britain is definitely in, and has long been in, a post-Christian society. The United States, not yet. 1 in 4 Americans identifies as an evangelical Christian. And the number of Americans who self-identify as some form of Christian is still quite high. Not so in Britain. And so the church remains a very powerful force. There's very negative elements of the church, but even the true church in the United States remains a powerful force. Not so anywhere in Western Europe, where the church attendance is less than 3%. But you see, once that bleeds out of a culture, you move increasingly towards barbarism. That's where you eventually go. Violent crime becomes much more common. Crime in general, becomes much more common. But then you start moving towards things like genocide. They become much more possible realities, and it's something that's not, common to the American experience. It's why Americans, as I argue, are generally quite naive when it comes to dangerous ideologies. And in a sense, I don't fault them for it. It's outside of their own experience. How could you expect them to be? But it does make Americans and America vulnerable to these types of ideologies. It's why we're seeing so many young people who think that communism, look at Mondani in New York. There are a lot of young people who believe the nonsense that guy is spouting, who believe the nonsense that AOC and Ilhan Omar are spouting, because it sounds good to them. It's utopian. And they want to be on the cutting edge of history and change, where they're ushering in a new era. This is an old story. Young people are used as the cannon fodder of every revolution, and soon the things that they helped demolish are missed and regretted. But genocide becomes much more of a possibility, and the reason for that is this, ladies and gentlemen. Murder Violent crime can be committed in a moment of passion. I haven't looked at the data, but my guess is it most of the time it usually is. Man finds his wife with another man, or two drunken fans in a bar get into a fight and it leads to manslaughter, or whatever the case may be. But genocide is different. To commit genocide, you need an ideology. Ideologies are necessary for genocide. And you may say, why is that? And that's because genocide, to create the sort of monsters that commit genocides, they're not usually actually crazy, not in the clinical sense. That's the excuse we all want to believe, because none of us really want to believe the truth about human nature. And that is, as I touched on last week, it's not Rousseau's idea that man is born basically good, but the biblical idea that man is born basically bad. Jeremiah 17:9, for the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked above all things. Who can know it? Which of us has really plumbed the depths of our own depravity? If you're honest with yourself, if you do a little Marcus Aurelius self-reflection from time to time, you will come to the conclusion that there are a lot of evil thoughts that pass through your head. That's why you shouldn't just say everything that comes into your head. Scripture says that babies, that we are born speaking lies. Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 21. That's where the case is made for original sin. We're all polluted by it. And as I talked about last week, we need the restraint of the Holy Spirit. But genocides are generally, they're committed by people who are possessed. Remember that word. They're possessed of an ideology, and where they suppress their natural revulsion and sense of justice when they're committing their crimes. This is what Dostoevsky is getting at in books like The Brothers Karamazov and in Crime and Punishment, and in a book that I'm going to lead a discussion on here. You can all get involved in it. We'll do a Zoom conversation on this. Just pay attention and we'll talk about it more. But on Dostoevsky's book, The Possessed, if you want to go ahead and get that book and get a head start, it's about this size, I should warn you. But the Constance Garnett translation is excellent. But it has also been translated, the title, The Possessed, has also been translated as demons and devils. And Richard Pivar and what's her name? Larissa Volokonsky, I think is the name. They've translated it as demons. Either is fine. You can go ahead and get them and start listening to them, or start reading them. But in those books, Dostoevsky is not dealing with simple murders. He's dealing with individuals who have been possessed. And that's because Dostoevsky saw evil ideologies like the ones we've been talking about, Islam being one of them, fascism, communism being, the others, Marxism. He saw them as demonic possessors of people, that the ideas themselves sock puppet individuals, and once they take over, an individual is altered. We see it in the kind of the crazy eyes of some of these Antifa types, of some of the Democrats and weffers that we've seen who are pushing genocidal ideas, but don't seem to realize it, because in their minds, they really believe, and this is C.S. Lewis, to do real evil, you have to believe that what you're doing is actually good. You have to believe that it's actually good. And an ideology, what it does, here's an illustration. Lev Kopelev, who was he was a Soviet. He was arrested, sent to prison. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, kind of, what should I say? He kind of parodies him in a novel of his called The First Circle. He doesn't call him by his actual name, but he sort of appears there as a kind of Old Testament prophet sort. And Kopelev was an interesting guy. Kopelev was Jewish. He was recruited as a young man after the Bolshevik Revolution, as many were. He was recruited into the pioneers, into the Komsomol, and basically the Hitler Youth, and he said he was a true believer. And he speaks of, Stalin being his high priest, and that Marx and Lenin were the authors of their holy writ. See, I mean, it's really quite religious. The overtones of Marxism, of communism, socialism are very religious. I mean, Lenin's mausoleum, where he's placed like a secular saint. I've gone through and I've seen him there many times. I like the way P.G. O'Rourke put it. He says his body lays there like a bad salad under a sneeze guard. I mean, that's where he sits. You can go through and you can see him to this day. Most of him is wax, but again, he's placed there like a secular saint. They have seized upon religious imagery in the pushing of the ideology. But Kopelev says, I was a young convert. I was a young believer in this utopian ideology. And he says, we were sent into the countryside. This is from a book of his called The Education of a True Believer. And he says, we were sent into the countryside to requisition grain. I read this book. The first time I read it was about 35 years ago. So forgive me if I'm getting some details not exactly correct, but I tend to have a pretty good memory about the things that I've read. And Kopelev says, here we are, these young bourgeois types from the cities, thinking ourselves much better than these peasants that we go out to see and to take their grain, because this was a period of famine, and we're taking their grain, we're seizing their grain, and we're taking it into the city. And if we find that they're hoarding any grain just for themselves or for their families, they're dug a hole and buried it in a field, or they're hiding it in a barn, or in the kitchen stove, they're to be punished. And in some cases, those people were deported to Siberia, executed. And Kopelev says, and this is the part I really want you to get, that I really want you to understand. Kopelev says, and I'm paraphrasing him, I'm putting this in my words, but essentially he had a natural revulsion to what they were doing. Not the peasants, but him and the people who are with him. And he's thinking to himself, what are we doing to these people? We're stealing their grain. They're going to starve. They're going to cannibalize each other because we're taking everything. And he says, in this revulsion I feel when it is expressed, others say to me, they're enemies of the people. They've stolen from the people. Or that I'm not fit to be part of the revolution if I feel sympathy for such people. And so Kopelev says that the ideology, you believe that the ideology, you've come to believe that it represents absolute truth, and therefore you suppress that little voice, that small voice, your conscience, God's law written upon your hearts. You suppress it, and you tell yourself that what you're doing is the right thing. Do you see how dangerous that is? Do you see how very dangerous that is? Because soon you kill conscience. And soon you can come to a place where lining up people against a wall and shooting them is just a big bunch of nothing to you. That's how genocides happen. And that's why, and it's not really my idea. Solzhenitsyn, who argued that some of the chief villains of Shakespearean literature, he says, characters like Macbeth and Iago. Iago's in, Othello. He says they're little lambs. And he said, why are they little lambs? Because they have no ideology. They're simply acting out of selfish motives. But the genocidal types, they have ideology. And that's what motivates them to kill, tens or hundreds or thousands or millions of people. That's what drives them to do it. And that's so true. And that's why these ideas are so incredibly dangerous. But you see, types that meet at places like the World Economic Forum and are gathering, in Democratic caucuses and at their convention and various think tanks, leftist think tanks around the world, they have already gone beyond this. They've already suppressed conscience. They've already suppressed that voice that is crying out and saying, don't do this, because what you're doing is going to have a terrible impact on the lives of so many people. But you see, because they are insulated from it and don't see it, they can kind of hide from the reality. Adolf Hitler himself never shot a Jew. He never went to a death camp. He forbid that the topic of the final solution to the Jewish question, as they called it, ever be brought up in his presence. Someone did once, and they were banned from ever being around him again. He thought that was so uncouth to mention that. But it was the reality of what he was doing. Don't you want to know what you're doing? No, he didn't want to know what he was doing. He didn't want to see it. He did not want to hear it. He wanted to be completely distanced from it. Why? Because there might have still been some bit of conscience that was plaguing him, that was haunting him, like in A Telltale Heart, Edgar Allan Poe, or Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Keeps me awake at night. Don't mention those things. I don't want to know about that. I just want happy things. Just happy things. Because I don't want to know what I'm actually doing to the lives of other people. Oh, how I would love to take by the hand so many reporters, so many people pontificating in our media, so many politicians, so many policy types. I would like to take them by the hand and take them into the third world and rub their face in the very policies that either A, they claim are doing great good, or B, they claim aren't happening at all. This is what was happening with mass migration. So that, again, to look at an idea here, when we're talking about open borders, how many of those people really had any idea what was happening to these children, to these women who are making their way through the Darien Gap? Almost none of them, if any at all, because they don't care. Because, again, those human beings are merely the eggs that you crack to make the omelet. And unfortunately, some people get killed along the way when you're creating utopia. It is what it is. That's the way they think. But the practical effect, of course, has been for the flooding into our country of another, into the West in general, of another ideology, and that's Islam. So that at places like Dearborn, Michigan, for example, and if Mondani gets his way, the whole of New York City will become trash-canistan. And the secular left are working with them to achieve it because they believe that at the end, they will be the last man standing. They believe that once they have destroyed the political right, whether you want to say that that's, it's motivated, strongly by the conservative ideas of the Christian faith, but you find its expression in a variety of ways, most powerfully and chiefly through America First, or MAGA, as it's called. They believe that once they're eliminated, they will turn their attention on Islam and they'll destroy them too. And then the secular utopia will be all that's left. I don't think it's going to play out like that. I don't think it's going to play out that way because I think they're also extremely naive about Islam. But see, that's what's happening. So you take an idea, upstream, like the Open Society, it gets bastardized by George Soros. He takes his old professor, Karl Popper's ideas. He changes them. He warps them into something that suits his own personal, vicious, vindictive, bitter, evil agenda. And then it finds expression in open borders where all these people come flooding in. So you see immediately the interaction, or rather the flow of the idea from its creation all the way downstream to its impact on the lives of billions of people. And the thing that I really want to drive home to you as it relates to Islam is the way Islam itself operates. In the third world, let's take, for example, Nigeria. Nigeria has been in the news a lot lately. And it has, for very good reason, because finally you're seeing a few headlines about what is happening to Christians in that country at the hands of Muslims. Two groups in particular, the Fulani Herdsmen Militia, which is an Islamic terrorist group, and Boko Haram, also another Islamic terrorist group. But also because in Nigeria, when the British left Nigeria and gave Nigeria its independence, Nigeria had a very strong Christian community. In fact, Nigeria would have called itself a Christian country. But slowly that has been changing. And let me explain to you the way that it does change. I say this as somebody who's been in Nigeria and have seen so much of this firsthand. And as you can imagine, I'm quintessentially American and I'm white. Add to that, my shock of gray hair, and I'm a big guy. I'm 6'3", and Nigerians, contrary to what most Africans believe, because they watch Nollywood, Nigeria churns out loads of movies, and it's created a certain mythology around Nigeria, and it's a very frightening mythology. Most Africans are not interested in going to Nigeria. They are terrified of Nigeria. Some of that for good reason. And it's not because bad things don't happen in other parts of Africa. It's because of the sheer scale of the terror, of the horror in Nigeria. So that neighboring Cameroonians, the idea of going to Nigeria is terrifying. Terrifying. All the more so if you're a white man. And that's because you can't hide. And because, as I say, I'm white, gray-haired, and tall, and the average Nigerian is not particularly big. The Bishop of Bakuru, my good friend Juan Jambez, who invited me there, said to me, he introduced me when I was speaking at the cathedral in Plateau State. He said he's the tallest man in Africa, tallest man in Nigeria, the biggest man in Nigeria. And of course he was joking, but only sort of kinda, because I stood head and shoulders above most Nigerians. And the point that I'm making there is that while he invited me sincerely, when I accepted the invitation, he was a little taken aback, because he says, we've invited so many Westerners to come and they refuse to come. He says, this part of Nigeria here in the north hasn't seen a white man for years. And I have to give a lot of thought, Larry, as to how we hide you, because you're going to stand out. And he says all the other white people who are flying into Abuja, almost to a man, they either work for the government or they work for oil companies, and they are immediately picked up at the airport in armored cars with heavily armed bodyguards. Not you. How's this going to work? Well, of course, I had to be hidden. I had to lay down in the car and driven to the north. I had no, weapons. I couldn't bring a weapon into the country. And the idea was just simply get me into a vehicle, lay the seat back, and drive as fast as possible 6 hours north of Abuja on open highway where the Fulani herdsmen militia and Boko Haram are known to lay down nail strips and just shoot up cars. That's what they do. And so as we're driving to the north, we're going through villages that are burning. And the villagers themselves, in some kind of effort to protect themselves, they put down, anything they can in the road to slow down the attackers, because the attackers come through in something like a Hilux, a Toyota. When you give up on a Toyota pickup truck and you've decided after 200,000 miles it's time to give up the ghost, that is taken to the third world where Africans will put another 300,000 miles on it. And terrorists love Toyotas. They do. The Hilux is their favorite. They can stand in the back, put a roll bar in it, and hang on with one hand and hold an AK-47 with the other. And they attack these villages like this. They drive through. These are real drive-by shootings. And so what do the villagers do? They set tires on fire, and they throw them down in the road, and rocks and sandbags and any barrier they can to try to slow them down so that they can get a shot off at them. So we're making our way through all these barriers and military checkpoints and things of this nature. And you're seeing, buildings on fire, and you're seeing, people who are very suspicious or hiding. And then if they see me, it attracted an awful lot of attention because they were not used to seeing white people that far north. And white people means money. As Juan would explain to me, as the bishop would explain to me, he says, they're just going to kill me. He says, but you, Larry, they'll want to kidnap you and start sending back to your family, parts of your body and demanding an enormous ransom, and then probably in the end kill you anyway. That's the way it works. And that is the way it works in so much of Africa. South America, parts of South America too, and the nature of my life, but parts of the Middle East, are also like this. But how did they get here? How did a country that had been left a kind of rich Christian tradition, which was introduced into the country in the 1930s? Christianity was very late to penetrate into deepest Nigeria. How did it happen? Well, as the Nigerians themselves would tell me, they've said that truckloads of Muslim children began appearing all over the north and central part of the country. And they would just drop these kids off and then drive off. And so you have all these, what are they? Orphan kids, they're begging all over the place. They're selling trinkets everywhere, and they're living out in the open. And Nigerian Christians said this became a pattern first in the early 2000s, and then around 2010, 11, and 12, we began seeing it again. Truckloads of kids being brought in. Well, the other side of that is it works like this. The average Muslim man is allowed 4 wives, according to their law, and countless, as many as he wants, mistresses. And these are individuals who are having, as I've said, not 3 or 4 or 5 children, which might be regarded as a very large family in the West, but we're talking dozens of children, maybe 50 children, maybe 100 children. And so when a mom comes to these parents and says, look, you can't take care of all these kids, we'll take them and we will educate them and we'll feed them. Parents say, please. So they load these kids up and they take them to neighboring countries. So maybe children are being brought in from Niger, maybe they're being brought in from Chad, and they're being dropped off. And the children are given a little bit of food, they're given things to sell. And you see them, they come and gather around me. And boy, did I ever attract a lot of attention in this part of the country. And by the way, I just said this on Twitter the other day, and it bears repeating here. When you are traveling in dangerous parts of the world, children are usually the greatest threat to your safety. And that is because they are used by cartels, by bandits, and by jihadists as their eyes and ears. So you see, let's say you're in, some dangerous, part of Colombia, and you see some Colombian children out playing soccer, and you think, oh, isn't that sweet? Well, one of them perhaps has a cell phone that's been given to him by the cartel or someone else. You fill in the blanks as who you want to put there. And he calls someone out of sight and says, there's an American here. I don't know what he's doing, but he's here. And the next thing you know, some guys show up with guns. Maybe that little boy is given some money. Maybe he's promised protection for his family. Maybe he's just given candy. But children like that are all over the world. And you have to be aware of them because they are used by criminal enterprises. And they're the ones who are reporting on you. They're the ones who are spying on you. And so in Nigeria, I was very aware of the fact that I was extremely vulnerable because children were seeing me and they were highly interested in me to see what they knew to be a Westerner and probably American, which means, again, worth something and maybe doing something important. Why would he be here? And that attracts attention. In any case, these children, they're all being dropped off. And then eventually what happens is this Muslim cleric is radicalizing them. He's teaching them. And then when the Fulani herdsmen or Boko Haram or whatever the Islamic terrorist group is, Al-Shabaab, whenever they decide they're ready to attack and kill Christians there, they come to these kids, they arm them with AK-47s, they give them a modicum of training, and then they say to them, show us where the vicar lives. Show us where the pastor lives. Show us where the people who attend this church live. And then they go out and kill them. This is what's been happening all over Western Africa, but particularly in Nigeria. That is the way that it works. And you see a lot, Westerners, this is completely foreign to Westerners and to Americans in particular, but you see they're using the same strategy in the United States. How Dearborn became Dearborn. Not because they were dropping off busloads of children per se, but because they're using that same kind of a colonization strategy and creating no-go zones where police, where other government personnel do not go, and they create mini Islamic states there, and where they do things the way they want to. Polygamy is illegal in the United States, not in those no-go zones. And it's illegal not to send your kids to school, or at least have some kind of accountability for their education. If you're homeschooling, they don't bother with these people. They do exactly what they want, and they are creating their own Sharia courts. They are operating according to Sharia law, and they are teaching children, radicalizing children with an ideology of conquest. And the way we got here, ladies and gentlemen, is through the bastardization of Karl Popper's open society philosophy. So you see, a secular ideology is creating a space for, and indeed laying the groundwork for the conquest of the West by Muslims who know very well what they're doing. We talked about this last week, and we touched on this, and it is important that you understand this. Historian Andrew Hussey said this. I was reading a book about Paris, and not many books on Paris are willing to touch on Islam, but this one did. And it quoted historian Andrew Hussey as saying this, and I liked it because I thought he put this very well. He says that Islam is not so much a religion as it is a ruthlessly efficient war machine. A ruthlessly efficient war machine. That's what Islam is. And you're naive if you think otherwise. I was reading through, and I try to read the comments as best I can. Again, if you want me to read them, if you make them really long, I don't. I just skip straight over them. And it's because I just don't have the time to read them. But the the brief couple of sentences comments I will read and respond to one way or another. Sometimes it's just to give it a thumbs up, and sometimes it's to give it a heart, or maybe a thumbs down, depending on what the comment is. But somebody came in there and said, that something to the effect I didn't know about Islam because I'd never been in an Islamic country. I have been in Islamic countries. I've had Muslims pointing weapons at me. I have been threatened by Muslims. In 2015, I wrote a piece. This was right after Charlie Hebdo. I wrote a piece for USA Today that went viral. We linked this in last week's show comments, and we'll link the show notes, and we'll link it again this time. And the article was titled, "Islam and Christianity Are Not Comparable." Or maybe it's Christianity and Islam aren't comparable, but something to that effect. But again, you can find it in last week's show notes if we forget to put it in this week's show notes. That piece went viral. Big time. Next thing I know, I get a call from Al Jazeera America. Al Jazeera America does not exist anymore, but they did at the time. And Al Jazeera America was an effort to create a kind of NBC, ABC, CNN type of network in the United States. It's being funded out of Doha. And so they went for the same kind of feel, talk shows and an anchor desk reporting the news of the day, and roundtable discussions, all of this. But it wasn't working. Americans were not trusting a news agency called Al Jazeera. Even though Al Jazeera, by the way, is massive. Al Jazeera is huge. Dwarfs BBC. Dwarfs Reuters. Dwarfs CNN. But not so much in the English-speaking world. And Al Jazeera America's domestic audience was only 15,000. So that's a typical podcast, for us. And, so, is that really worth doing? So they called and said, hey, we would love for you to come and debate your article on one of our talk shows. And I knew that their domestic audience wasn't particularly big. And I was thinking, I really don't like going to New York. And it's a big commitment in time. I'll be gone for at least 2 days. And, And then they said, we are planning to broadcast it to our entire global audience. That's 270 million people. And I thought, okay, well, this would give me the opportunity to make a defense for the Christian faith on a global stage. And that does appeal to me. It gives me the opportunity to push back against the opposition. And because it was going to be broadcast, not so much in the United States or Britain, or in so much in English-speaking parts of the world, but it was going to be broadcast chiefly into Muslim countries, into Islamic states. I had an opportunity to push back at those people, but also to encourage the Christians in their midst who are hiding or being persecuted in such countries. I have the opportunity to put a bounce in their step and say, I'm speaking for you. So I said, okay, I'll do that. Next thing I know, I get a call from Jay Sekulow. Some of you will know who he is. He was Donald Trump's Donald Trump's lawyer during the impeachment. One of them, anyway. One of his attorneys. Jay Sekulow is a prominent voice, conservative voice, has been for many years. And he was told by then Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, who I knew, that I was about to do this debate. And Jay calls me up. Senator Sessions, Attorney General Sessions, gives him my cell phone number, and he calls me up and he says, this is Jay Sekulow. I understand you're about to go on Al Jazeera to debate the validity of Islam and Christianity and atheism. That was another component of the discussion. I said, I am. He said, don't do it. every AK-47 wielding terrorist in the world is going to see you and want to kill you. And I mean, they are going to send very descriptive threats to you. Don't do this. He said, I did it. He said, I went on Al Jazeera, English or Arabic. I can't recall, but he said, I went on one of those channels to debate a Muslim. And he said, the next thing I know, I was getting just loads of death threats. And I was silent. And Jay said, you're planning to do it anyway, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. He said, Larry, what's your budget? And our budget, fixed point in those days, I don't remember. I said, our total budget for all of our employees is X, not a whole lot, less than probably the money, the salary that he made. He said, then I take it you can't afford any bodyguards. And I said, nope, I don't have any bodyguards. He says, Larry, I have 4 armed bodyguards with me at all times. And you can't afford that. And you're planning to do this. It's not a wise thing to do. And I said, Jay, I'm so grateful for your call. I appreciate this. I appreciate the warning. And I meant that sincerely because he meant me good. I said, but Jay, I cannot face my brothers and sisters who are suffering for Christ in the third world at the hands of these people and tell them that I refused to do this debate. I refused to go where God was leading because I was afraid. Because I was afraid of people calling me names, because I was afraid of people threatening me. And for that reason, I have to go. This is a door the Lord has opened, and I must walk through it. And I don't say that to you, by the way, to suggest that me doing that was some kind of great, courageous act. I actually don't think of it like that. The real courage is exhibited by those people every day living in countries where they suffer extraordinary persecution, where many of their friends and family members have been executed, where daughters have been taken off into sex slavery, where wives have been raped, where sons and husbands and brothers and fathers have been put to the machete. That is bravery, to continuing to say, I will not convert to your religion. I will not relent, and I will not deny the name of Jesus Christ. But see, it's because all of that is happening. Secularists know that it's happening, and they want it to happen. The aforementioned Bishop of Bukuru, when he invited me to Nigeria, which was a very tense, experience, he was telling me that many of the people in his diocese had been attacked and murdered. I've put some of these pictures up on X, on my Twitter account, in the last couple of weeks. And a lot of these people had been murdered. And he said, I'm doing a mass burial, 150 of my members of my church murdered. And during the burial, he says, the Fulani herdsmen are taking shots at us with AK-47s from a tree line as they see us gathered, and they think it's another opportunity to kill Christians. Some Christians within the community there decided, it's time that we push back, and it's time that the Christians themselves be armed against these people. So the next time the Fulani herdsmen attacked, I think this was in 2012, the Christians were ready. They were waiting for them, and they inflicted enormous casualties on these Muslim terrorists. Do you know what happened? The United Nations, again, the point I'm making here is how secularism, militant secularism, and militant Islam are working together. The United Nations came in to Plateau State and other places where Christians had been armed to protect themselves. And they took away their weapons, and said it was a human rights violation. They didn't take away the weapons from the Muslims, only from the Christians. They did it with the full intention of making them vulnerable to being murdered, to being hauled off into sex slavery, to being hauled off into slavery in general. They did it deliberately. That is because both of these ideologies want the complete destruction of the Christian faith. Now, having said all of this, I want to close with this thought as I try to leave you with a positive thought each week, but not just some kind of Pollyanna thought. Secularism has no God except themselves, except Satan himself. Islam has a false God. They're actually worshiping a demon and don't even know it. The Christian faith, however, we worship the one true God, a triune God, a God who said, "Let there be light," a God who became man and dwelt among us, who gave his life as a ransom for many, who said that those who believe in him should never die, but should have everlasting life, and a God who said, "I am coming again, and when I do, he's coming as a massive invasion to rescue his own and to judge those who have denied him, those who have persecuted his people, his children, those who have gone to war against him." That should comfort you, because the end of the story, as I say, has already been written. We win. We win. And whatever the circumstances we're seeing around the world, you must understand that unlike other, what do I want to say, other competing forces, we have God. We have the Lord. We have the Holy Spirit, who is at work in this world and who is at work in his people, and who tells us to trust him and act accordingly, to trust him and act accordingly. And so I want to encourage all of you, wherever you are in your life, wherever you are geographically, wherever you are spiritually, repent of your sins. Know that that once you have, God throws them into the sea of forgetfulness and remembers them no more, and move forward with confidence in him, not in yourself, but confidence in him, and knowing that he has called you to do such things, to go and engage the people around you. We are here to reclaim this world on behalf of the God that we serve, Jesus Christ, who is a merciful God, a loving God, and he's nothing like the demonic, damnable God of Islam. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.